I'm going to invite you all to take a seat. So we have two more presentations. We're going to take a brief break, and then that will be followed by a discussion period. I also want to let you know that the museum, the Searing Wing, where the Veronese exhibition is on exhibit, will be open until 5:30. So when we leave here today, we invite you to come over to the museum and spend some time admiring this exhibition with all of this new knowledge that you possess. So, Dr. Brilliant.
Okay. Next up, we'll be hearing from John Marchiari. John is the curator of European art and head of provenance research at the San Diego Museum of Art. A specialist in Italian and Spanish paintings of the 16th and 17th centuries. His current projects include the first ever scholarly catalog of Italian, Spanish, and French paintings before 1850 at the San Diego Museum of Art, and the exhibition Francesco Vanni, Art in Late Renaissance Siena, to be held at the Yale University Art Gallery in 2013, something to look forward to. At the San Diego Museum of Art, John has been responsible for many exhibitions and major reinstallations of the permanent collection. He received his PhD from Yale and is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. And today, he will be speaking to us. The title of his talk is L'abbiamo fatto tutti noi, Veronese's Workshop, a highly contested issue. I added that. Welcome, John.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Virginia, and everyone at the Ringling for this. It's with some trepidation that I take up the remote, but it worked. My paper is less of a compact narrative argument than more a series of random speculations. I hope it's clear by the end of it why I'm going about things this way. Paolo Veronese had a successful and immensely productive career as an artist, and it's long been acknowledged that he could never have executed so many commissions if he had not had a large and well-organized workshop. It's also well known that the workshop continued to produce paintings in Veronese style even after Paolo's death in 1588. Works like the Baptism of Christ from the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York are based on some of Paolo's surviving drawings, but must have been painted wholly after his death and bear the unexpected signature Erede Pauli Cariali Faciebat. The heirs of Paolo made this. The signature hides down here in the water and reads at the very bottom of the picture. This collective signature, even more striking than the Peterzano signature that Stephen showed us, this collective signature must have surprised some patrons, and it was presumably in response to a question about it that Benedetto Cagliari, Paolo's brother and longtime assistant, described the collaborative working process in the family workshop after Paolo's death. Writing in an undated letter to Giacomo Contarini, that is, Benedetto explained that when a patron decided on a subject, the composition would be drawn up by Benedetto, sketched out on the canvas by his nephew Carlo, and finished by Carlo's brother Gabriele, da me disegnato, da Carlo abbozzato, e da Gabriele finite. Art historians have typically seized upon this rare bit of verbal evidence. Indeed, half the essays, including my own, in the current exhibition catalog refer to it. And there are numerous cases in which drawings by Paolo's are preparatory for paintings surely executed by others. There is not, however, visual or technical evidence that the workshop adopted a systematic production like that described by Benedetto, in which various stages of a painting would be assigned to specific members of the workshop. On the contrary, we repeatedly read in the Veronese literature arguments that one or another infelicitous figure, limb, or patch of drapery is by Benedetto, Carlo, or some unnamed assistant, claims based on the assumption that the production of paintings was more haphazard, with Paolo working up some parts and then assigning other parts to one or more artists. Benedetto's letter, in consequence, should be understood as a kind of rhetorical trope aimed at justifying the persistence of the family brand. As such, I believe we do well to consider it alongside the nearly contemporary, often cited, and equally rhetorical statement by the Carracci, who, when asked which of them had painted this or that element of the Palazzo Magnani in Bologna, replied, "Elle dei Carracci, l'abbiamo fatto tutti noi." It's Carracci. We did it. All of us. Again, this was a defense of the family brand, but it also serves as a reminder of the fundamentally collaborative nature of many artistic workshops of the Renaissance and Baroque eras. The Carracci dictum has not, however, stopped succeeding centuries of art historians from trying to distinguish one from another artist's hand in the painted decorations. The case with the works done by Veronese in his workshop is similar. Even works signed collectively by the heirs of Paolo, or by Paolo himself, have been regularly considered the work of one or another member of his workshop. Now, for those not entirely familiar with this material, I should clarify that when we discuss collaboration, we are not in this context talking about apprentices and low-level assistants who ground colors, prepared paint, seamed canvases, or laid down ground layers. Instead, we mean the artists responsible for the design of a composition, and in this case, even more, for the painters responsible for the completed painted surface. In the case of Veronese, these collaborators included his brother Benedetto, his nephew Alvise del Friso, his sons Gabriele and Carletto, Francesco Montemezzano, and a host of others. Now, what I want to do today is look at this question of workshop practice in that studio. This is not a new subject by any means. Every monograph on Veronese, at least since Fiocco's in 1928, has offered thoughts on the attribution to assistants of various paintings. And the issues of the workshop were brought to the fore in David Rosen's 1972 exhibition, in Roger Rearick's 1988 exhibitions, in Beverly Brown's off-sided paper delivered after the 1988 exhibition, and by Diana Gisolfi in a number of articles. Even looking to the catalog of the current show, there are references to workshop involvement in the essays by Gisolfi, Brilliant, Ilchman, Grit, Dorman, and Patton, as well as my own. The workshop presents, obviously, one of the more complicated questions that this exhibition seeks to answer. The matter of dealing with the workshop, not only in choosing works for the exhibition, but also in deciding how to label those works, is something that Virginia and Frederick have discussed or debated many times over the past few years. Following from those discussions and following from some comments made in my own essay on Veronese's drawing practice, I was asked to take a stab at the problem here in the symposium. Some months ago, I boldly agreed to do this. But over the past months, as I've thought more and more about these issues, I fear that I've grown less and less confident of our judgments, including my own. And instead, I keep returning to another point I made in my essay, which is that it might be nearly impossible to isolate a quote-unquote pure Veronese and put him on exhibition. So complicated was his workshop procedure. In contrast to many artistic workshops of the time, where there's a pretty clear divide between the paintings by the workshop and those by the master, Veronese seems to me a case of an exceptionally well-trained and well-organized workshop, where the division of labor is nearly impossible to sort out with any degree of certainty. My main contention, if indeed I have one today, is that we make many mistakes by trying to fit Veronese and his studio into a preconceived paradigm of how workshops worked. Collectively, we have too often been inconsistent when positing that a painting is all or partly by Veronese. In his essay in the exhibition catalog, Stephen Grit takes up this matter, and I want to continue along those lines here. What I want to do today is, I suppose, to take stock of the issues, to weigh some of the evidence, and to put the problems in perspective. Or to put it another way, as my wife said to me when I explained what I was going to do, this is a kind of position paper in which I'll air my complaints with some sloppiness in Veronese scholarship and advance a few heresies. Now, moving forward. To begin, let's look back to see where this language of Veronese and workshop, all in quotation marks, comes from. Even the earliest sources discuss the master's assistants, but I would say that the term end workshop has been used at least since the 18th century to connote quality. One reads in 18th century Grand Tour diaries that this or that painting is, quote unquote, a school piece. And this was then adopted, standardized, and widely diffused by the Baedeker guides. It boils down thus. A great Veronese is presumed to be wholly by the master alone. It is an autograph painting. A good to middling Veronese is often described as Veronese and workshop, and a dissatisfying painting in Veronese style would generally thus be described as by the workshop of Veronese. Particularly in the case of the Veronese and workshop category, this is connoisseurship as a kind of value judgment, not as a reflection of things actually seen that would indicate the work of more than one artist in a picture. This is a matter where subjective taste substitutes for actual qualities, or perhaps where commercial hopes have skewed our understanding of the artist. After all, this language, in its current refinement, is carefully outlined at the back of any Sotheby's or Christie's catalog, which alone ought to remind us that it's less about art historical critical judgment than about commercial value. And it's based on a post-romantic idea of great artists as solitary creative geniuses. Yet it has implications far beyond the sale room. How many paintings in smaller American museums are consigned to the vaults because they were called Veronese and workshop in a catalogue raisonné written by a scholar who may have known the work only from a black and white photo? Yet we equate collaboration with less importance. What if we flip the equation around? Why can't a great Veronese be collaborative? We know from the documents, and this has been mentioned several times, that Veronese had assistants at San Sebastiano in Venice, and in Padua when he painted the great Santa Giustina altarpiece. But are these somehow less important as monuments or less successful as paintings because of that? Turning again to works in museums, what are we really trying to say with our labels? On the one hand, there's an honesty in identifying many works as Veronese and workshop, because we know that there was indeed a large workshop that helped produce many of these paintings. On the other hand, isn't it a somewhat meaningless term? Where do we stop? Do we need to label every Veronese and workshop? Or every Veronese after 1575 or so? Or every Veronese in a provincial museum, but not those in the Prado or Accademia? We quickly run afoul of institutional pride, and in exhibitions we are further constrained by the demands of lenders who refuse loans if they are to carry such labels. And then turning to other artists, where does the practice stop once we start down the road of these and workshop labels? What do we do with all those portraits by Van Dyck? So at left you see a Henrietta Maria in my museum in San Diego, which is one of very many Van Dycks described in the catalogue raisonné as the best known version of a lost original. Frequency of language that ought to raise a few questions on its own. And not to detract from the splendid paintings by Rubens here in Sarasota, but are they really all 100% by Rubens himself? Even many of Rubens's small sketches seem, after having served their preparatory function, to have been touched up by a second hand and turned into sellable pictures. And lest you think I'm only picking on the Rubens, here, this is a picture in San Diego, a sketch for the tapestry series of which the Ringling has the great cartoons, in which I believe that some of the flesh tones, some of the pinks were laid in after the fact to turn this into a harder, more finished-looking painting. Likewise, that head study at the Timken Museum, also in San Diego, probably did start its life as a study from life of some studio assistant, but then got tarted up and turned into a sellable picture later on. And then, not to reduce this to absurdity, but what do we do with an artist like Bridget Riley, who proudly notes that she rarely touches her paintings, but acts instead like the conductor of her assistants? I like her there on the scaffolding, offering a kind of Veronese hand gesture. think of the absurdity of labeling a Riley as an and workshop piece, but it's something that came out of Veronese's studio with his imprimatur and a Veronese signature any less a true Veronese than Bridget Riley's paintings are. Look, I'm all for connoisseurship, more so than most people, having on more than one occasion done the scholarly equivalent of submitting myself to the judgment of a pack of wolves by proposing a very fancy attribution. But let's remember that the practice of connoisseurship got a bad name in art history, and not only because it bore the taint of the market. Connoisseurship seemed the province of snooty men in monocles making subjective judgments. And it is subjective. One man's deft highlights or vigorous brushwork are another's unresolved, I feel like Francis Haskell, are another's unresolved daubs on the surface. What is praised is a bravura late style in the Washington St. Lucie, which is the picture at upper left, is the same sort of technique, or a technique analogous to that, which is dismissed in other paintings as being a late workshop production. We're back in that muddle of taste versus quality. And of course, there's this difficult issue of translating visual evidence into verbal fact, although that's also what makes the study of art so entertaining and appealing. Now, some of us like to think that we've moved on and that we can make better informed and more objective connoisseurial judgments. But in this case, until we really clarify exactly what we mean to convey with that Veronese and workshop label, until it's not more than a mere value judgment, I'm not sure we're doing any better than Daumier's dilettantes. So what things might we consider before making our connoisseur's pronouncements? There does seem to be adequate evidence that Veronese, like many painters of his time, took into account the intended location of his work, and we're thus ideally forewarned to consider this as well. This is something that has been discussed recently by Stephen Gritt in relation to the Repentant Magdalene from Ottawa. When seen today in the museum, the figure's torso seems oddly, dissatisfyingly elongated, an apparently misunderstood anatomy that is one of the qualities that consigns a painting to the end workshop dustbin, on the assumption that Veronese, by virtue of being a master artist, knew how to draw his body as well. This has led to two related judgments. First, Gritt has argued that in its original location, where it was seen from below and to the left, the body might have resolved itself into more perfect apparent proportions, so that those who might have dismissed the work because of its apparent awkwardness would be mistaken. And the complicated image on the right is the overlay of a drawing of the Magdalene as seen from below and to the left, which justifies that that picture was in such a position. And the drawing does correct some of that anatomical infelicity of the body. But without belaboring this point, there is another assumption that must be readdressed. This notion that Veronese was a master of anatomy, and that awkwardness indicates workshop involvement. A painting like the Omaha Venus can only really be imagined as intended to be seen straight on in a gallery setting. Yet, is this torso really so satisfactory? And while the Magdalene and the Venus are perhaps disputable attributions, look at the LA County allegorical figure, which I don't think anyone wants to call anything other than a pure autograph Veronese. But isn't anyone else a bit troubled by the long-limbed and disjointed body? Anatomical infelicities do not a workshop picture make. It's lamentable that the picture on the right is not in the show, but not all of our colleagues were as generous as they might have been. Oh, wait, we're webcast. Similarly, as Nicholas Penny and Marika Spring observed, the consecration of St. Nicholas in London, which was for San Benedetto Po, like the picture from the Chrysler that is here in the show, that the picture in London is most successful when seen so that the lowest head, that of St. Nicholas, is above ours. So there's a correction by accounting for original location. Yet Penny and Spring also note that the wing of the angel at the top appears behind the column, while the angel is apparently positioned in front of the crowd closest to us. And where is the angel's right arm anyway? Is this a workshop issue? Or was Paolo just not that attentive to anatomy, particularly when painting a figure high up in an altarpiece for a dark church that was 105 miles away from Venice? Why must we presume that he was a stickler for perfect anatomical description? And what of a slightly bad day or a bad week in the long career of an artist? In his otherwise glowing review of the Ringling exhibition, Peter Humphrey notes of the Cleveland Annunciation, which is labeled Veronese and Workshop, that, quote, perhaps it does not quite show the superlative quality of the master's finest works, yet it is nonetheless a painting of inner coherence as well as of great beauty, end quote. In other words, Humphrey seems to be suggesting that Paolo might not have had his best day, but that this work could still well be by him. In the case of this and every other painting from Cleveland, we also need to remember the issue of condition, as these works have suffered terribly through repeated attempts at cleaning over their long history. Now, as a bit of similar anecdotal evidence for the practice of painters, I think it's interesting to consider this Angel by Bernardo Rosselli, a work in my museum in San Diego. This is a fragment from the upper right corner of a huge altarpiece that, like much of Rosselli's work, would have been made for a provincial Tuscan church. It's a commonplace in art history that 15th century Florentine artists were the consummate craftsmen, painstakingly careful with their works, never making mistakes. Yet, when we recently cleaned this work, we were shocked to discover just how sloppy it was, how careless the painter was. A large blue drip of paint, which you see down here at the bottom, is not a crack in the panel, but is literally a drip of the original paint on the surface of the painting. And at the top of the altarpiece, cut off, say, for this one fragment of a wing, there would have been a row of red seraphim. Well, the red paint from those seraphim is speckled across the rest of the surface of the painting. And one rather large drop of that red paint falls just on the tip of the nose of the angel, which is absolutely invisible here in the slide. So sloppy, so distracting that in the conservation campaign we felt we actually had to touch it back out again, lest every viewer to the gallery focus simply on that angelic pimple. My point in bringing this in is to illustrate something that seems common sense once we stop to think about it. Not every painting would get an artist's full effort, especially works sent to dark and distant churches. Now, returning to Veronese, against that idea, let's think for a moment about the Petrobelli altarpiece, which has been so much vaunted in recent years. It's been written that Veronese was still early in his career in 1563 and that he didn't have a very large studio, so that he executed most of the huge, now dismembered, altarpiece by himself. Yet, we know that Veronese had worked with a team of assistants as early as the late 1550s at San Sebastiano. Moreover, he had, at just the same time that he was doing the Petrobelli altarpiece, huge projects, like the enormous wedding at Cana, now in the Louvre, made for San Giorgio Maggiore, as well as pictures like the San Zaccaria altarpiece, now in the Accademia. With works like these, for major commissions for major Venetian centers, can we really be so sure that a big altarpiece for the Petrobelli chapel in San Francesco at Lendinara, 50 miles from either Venice or Verona, really got the master's full attention? Or is it safer to assume that the workshop helped Veronese? And if the workshop could have played a significant role in that work, which is admittedly of high quality, why do we associate the workshop only with mediocrity? Now, leaving this issue of location behind, let's turn to the connoissorial trap of single originals. These two paintings, The Finding of Moses in Washington and that in the Prado, were at the heart of Beverly Brown's discussion of Veronese's workshop at the time of the Washington exhibition. She considered the Prado version an autograph original and universally attributed the other known version, including the National Gallery's painting, to the workshop. Why? Because the Washington canvas had certain changes that showed it to have been adapted from the Prado painting, and also because Brown said that the Washington painting was, quote, simply not good enough to be an autograph Veronese. There were those who, at the time in 1988, disagreed. And I think anyone seeing the Washington painting here in the exhibition after its recent cleaning can raise the question of whether we'd ever consider this anything other than an autograph work if the Prado painting weren't around to compare it. Moreover, Brown dismissed the Washington canvas as a copy because the woman at far left in the midground, here, who adjusts her sandal, was said to have, quote, lost the tree on which she leans, so that she gestures futilely into space. Now, a bit more examination would have helped here, for the tree was there, half hidden behind the frame and half covered with later repainting. And I'm told by colleagues in the conservation studio in Washington that this was a perfectly well-known fact in 1988, having been noted in several earlier conservation surveys. So two mistakes were made. One, the assumption that only a single version by Veronese himself could exist, and two, the connoisseurial judgment on the Washington painting was made a bit off the cuff without taking all of the evidence into consideration. The huge Adoration of the Magi, now in London, originally for San Silvestro in Venice, and the related painting in Santa Corona in Vicenza can be used to address similar issues in paintings of a far larger scale than the small Finding of Moses canvases. The London version is dated 1573, and as such is earlier than the Santa Corona painting, which documentary evidence that I won't go through indicates to be later. Moreover, the drawing in the Taylor's Museum seems to show Veronese working the composition out for the London version, for the first version, suggesting that it is obviously an original. Yet, as Penny and others have noted, the painting in Santa Corona is patently of a higher quality. It is more autograph, in Penny's terms, while the larger, earlier version in London has no pentiments, no changes during its execution, which is in contrast to Paolo's almost universal practice of making changes during the execution of his large works. Paradoxically, the earlier work, although for that great monument of San Silvestro, seems to have been executed in large part by the workshop following Paolo's designs, while the second version is apparently to a greater degree by Paolo himself. That something is a second version does not therefore preclude its being by Veronese. The Kansas City Christ and the Centurion is, as often stated, a later version of another painting at the Prado. We've seen this work several times over the last 2 days. What remains to be decided is how much of it is actually by Veronese, and that's something for us all to discuss in the exhibition. Turning from the question of versions, we might also bring up the matter of signatures. A number of paintings have signatures that have been determined to be original. That is to say, the signature was added to the painting while the paint was still wet. Yet, these do not guarantee anything. A forged painting would have a signature that appears original if it were put on when the time the forgery was made. But even putting forgeries aside, a Veronese signature only seems to mean that a painting was from his workshop. Take, for example, the Saint Herculanus in Tuscolano Moderno. This bears a Paolo signature, and the beautiful preparatory drawing from Princeton, here in the exhibition, would seem to indicate that Paolo was responsible for the conception of the piece. At least no one, including myself, has ever questioned that drawing as being Paolo's own, although it is, on reflection, a unique instance of a drawing executed wholly in wash. It could be a late experiment by an aging master, or it could perhaps be by Carletto or someone else. There isn't really a way to know. The drawing's inscription, of course, is no more trustworthy than the signature on the painting. Now, for the painting, Luciano Crozzato Larcher considered this to have been executed by Carletto. More recently, Andreas Prever has identified as the work of Benedetto, and it's really hard to know exactly how to judge. One of the things that I'll keep coming back to is the great ambiguity in these matters. Roger Rearick certainly had his own ideas of what constituted a work by Benedetto, Alvise, or Carletto, but he never published anything that really set the matter out. The longest, most sustained attempt to sort out the various hands was probably in the series of articles by Crozzato Larcher published in the Arte Veneta in the 1960s, and she adopted a logical methodology. Start with works signed or documented as being by the various hands, for example, the picture at left here in the exhibition, signed Carletto, and then work outward from there. Alas, the number of dissenting opinions on many, I think it's fair to say most of her attributions over the past 30 years, is an indication that few have found her list satisfying. And Professor Rosen last night mentions Hans-Dieter Huber's huge book that also tries to sort out the hands. And he asked me whether I was going to review the book. But I have to admit that both the ponderous German and the even heavier overlay of theoretical methodology have led me to shy away from it. In his article in the exhibition's catalog, though, Stephen Gritt argues that even a painting signed by Carletto, the Magdalene at left, is possibly reworked by Paolo. although this is a conclusion that might well be debated. If even signed paintings are thus uncertain, we're on truly slippery ground when we're trying to attribute something like the Ringling's own terribly damaged Hagar, there at right. And in contrast to these matters, there is much that's similar in the signed Carletto and in the Getty's Baptism of Christ, which I seem to have forgotten to put a slide of, which is more than a mere retouching of the painting it left could account for. So could that Getty picture actually be by Carletto if this one is? Or are both by Paolo despite the signature? The Hagar brings up another issue, which is that of condition. And the Apollo and Daphne from San Diego is an interesting case in point. This work has been in San Diego pretty much from the moment of its modern rediscovery in 1945, and I am quite certain it's been known to most scholars only through black and white photographs. It has been most often dated to the 1570s or even the 1580s, because at first glance, especially in black and white photographs, it seems to be executed in the sketchier, looser style of Veronese's later work. Yet the sketchy quality results more from its condition than its execution. The sky, for one, was painted with that smalt-based pigment, which has lost its blue color. But even more problematically, the painting was built up in a series of oil glazes that were almost entirely removed from the painting long ago in a series of harsh cleanings, although they can be found in the interstices of the canvas upon close examination. What this means is that the picture was done in the 1560s, though, rather than the 1580s. And if it's to be written off as a workshop painting, it needs to be taken against the other works of those dates. It can't simply be one of many sketchy paintings from the 1580s workshop, because the picture is patently from an earlier moment in Veronese's career when he and his assistants used thin oil glazes rather than those thick impastos and dry highlights we see in the later works. I might close with a few more thoughts about technical analysis. I hope it's clear from my comments that I believe a great deal of information might be gained in the conservation studio. I think we need to keep in mind, though, that technical analysis can never alone prove an attribution. It can be discovered that a particular combination of pigments, a type of canvas, a ground layer, or imprimatura used in a painting are exactly like those in other paintings by Veronese. But for me, this indicates merely that a work came from his studio. All of the painters trained by Paolo and working in his studio would share his materials and techniques. I think we need only think of the mess of the Rembrandt Research Project to remember these conditions. Similarly, though, the discovery in an X-radiograph of many changes to a painting, and I just, for the sake of example, have thrown up the X-ray in full and a detail of the much-discussed Alexander before the family of Darius before Alexander, where in X-ray, up here in the sky, there's a great blob that indicates there were changes made in the execution of the work. I'm not actually going to talk about, though. The discovery of many changes to a painting can suggest that a work is not a simple copy. But again, those changes do not necessarily need to have been made by Paolo. For indeed, his studio seems generally not to have made straight copies of Paolo's works, but rather variations on his inventions, such that it would not be surprising to find changes made as a painting begins on one model and evolves into another during the course of its execution by the workshop. So where do we go from here? And there's a kind of visual joke here, and industry or its various other interpretations, and moderation maybe being the buzzwords. At the beginning of my paper, I noted that I do not have a new concrete guide for sorting out the actual workings of the Veronese studio, nor for determining which paintings are wholly by Paolo and which are collaborations or works entirely by one or more assistants. For today, all I've sought to do is to point out some of the pitfalls that we need to avoid as we go forward, to avoid common fallacies like the presumption that Veronese was always a master of anatomy, or that a document or signature is an accurate guide to the creator of a painting. I'd also make a plea for a consistency, because as a curator of a provincial museum, I can cite many, many examples in which paintings in out-of-the-way places are not given a fair treatment in the literature. But in the absence of trustworthy, absolutely rock-solid verbal or technical evidence, we do need return in the end to the question of the eye, to old-fashioned connoisseurship, or to at least a modernized twist on it. And if I seem to be prevaricating in many of my judgments, I think it bears reminding that connoisseurship might be defined as the art of, and science of knowing what you cannot prove. If you can prove it, it's not connoisseurship. The science of it might be in understanding all of the evidence, taking into account patronage, location, technical study, condition, etc. But the art of it is in knowing how or being able to interpret that evidence. And along those lines, one last key lesson is that nothing can really replace the experience of seeing things side by side in an exhibition. A show like this one, in which the list of objects goes beyond the canon of acknowledged masterpieces, can in many ways teach us far more than the blockbuster with the set of familiar paintings. So thank you to Virginia for persisting in this endeavor. And there are things that really do jump out in the show, and of different types. The Blaffer portrait, for example, doesn't fit at all, and doesn't even seem to be a Veronese workshop product, but who else could have done that? Whereas the Auto will rest on the flight is schematic, as if someone were copying Veronese's technique of painting drapery, and it's clearly by someone other than the master. Whereas the Seattle painting strikes me as a far better painting than its reputation holds. But it does seem to me by yet another distinctive hand. And only by bringing works like these together can we begin to sort out who Veronese really is and how his workshop really worked. One hypothesis I might advance after spending a few hours in the show yesterday is that there might be fewer collaborative paintings and more that are entirely by one or another assistant, albeit using Paolo's inventions. And lastly, a symposium such as this, where we have the opportunity not only to see works side by side, but to discuss them with our colleagues, is particularly valuable. However difficult it is to say exactly who or what Veronese is, we can at least state after such an exercise, and after what will, I'm sure, be some strong debates in the galleries, that we forged our understanding together. L'abbiamo fatto tutti noi. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So I'm just going to say, when you go into the exhibition, just ignore all of the attributions on the labels. So for our last speaker today, I'd like to introduce Caroline Campbell. Caroline studied modern history at University College, Oxford, followed by an MA and PhD from the Courtauld Institute in London, also my alma mater. If we had a school cheer, I would perform it now. We do not. She has recently taken up the appointment of Curator of Italian Paintings before 1500 at the National Gallery of London. Prior to this, she was Schroeder Foundation Curator of Paintings at the Courtauld Gallery from 2005 to 12, and Assistant Curator of Renaissance Paintings at the National Gallery from 2001 to 5. Caroline has curated a number of exhibitions, including Peter Lely, A Lyrical Vision, Love and Marriage in Renaissance Florence, All Spirit and Fire, Oil Sketches by Tiepolo, and Bellini and the East. And she has published extensively in the fields of Italian Renaissance art and its reception. Together with colleagues, she was responsible for a complete redisplay of the Courtauld's permanent collection galleries in 2011. Caroline.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone at the Ringling for making my stay here, and in fact my visit, so pleasurable and possible. Now, my talk today proposes to place Paolo Veronese in the context both of his Venetian past and his future, looking at his work together with that of painters active in Venice from the 15th to the 18th century. Veronese has been described by a number of art historians as the linchpin, whatever that may mean, of the Venetian tradition. Without Veronese, we cannot comprehend Tiepolo, but also, without Bellini and Titian, we cannot fully grasp Veronese. Of course, and I must state at the outset, Veronese was not strictly a Venetian. He was born and received his formation in Verona, and aspects of his style, as we've heard, have more in common with the traditions of painting in Verona than they do necessarily strictly with that of Venice. But Paolo Veronese, born in the Venetian terraferma and became an adopted Venetian. And it was he whom Titian praised and promoted, rather than the native Venetian painter, Tintoretto, and the happy manner which Veronese adopted, to paraphrase Henry James, has become identified in the minds of posterity as the quintessence of 16th century Venice. And that is also how it was seen in the 18th century. And indeed, for a lot of posterity, something like the Ringling picture has been identified as the quintessence of Veronese, and not much emphasis given to what we've heard about, the more sort of sad aspects of it, the fact that we see the Christ here on the flight, but also we see signs of his death as well. And it was as the exemplar of Renaissance Venice that Paolo Veronese's paintly legacy was used by his greatest spiritual heir, Giovanni Battista Tiepolo. And of course, I'm not counting the heirs of Paoli, who John Marchiari has just discussed. Count Francesco Algarotti, Tiepolo's supporter, who promoted his pictures around the great and the good of the Europe in the 18th century, called Tiepolo the Emulo di Paolo. It is around the figure of Tiepolo and his response to the Venetians' past and pictorial precedents that I've made this lecture. And Tiepolo's indebtedness to Veronese has long been recognized. It's scarcely rocket science. And it's presently the subject of a very fascinating exhibition in Udine, curated by William Barkham, Linda Borean, and Caterina Farlan. But that shouldn't stop us from looking at the subject here today in Sarasota, and also from considering, perhaps, if there might be a golden thread, as it were, connecting the artists of 15th and 16th century Venice, such as Giovanni Bellini, to Veronese, and thence to Tiepolo. And I use the word golden advisedly, mindful of the praise bestowed in the 16th and 17th centuries, both within Venice and abroad, upon the Republic's remarkably stable structures of governance, based on the principle of the aurea mediocritas, which we've heard about a lot today, which shunned ostentation in favor of the general benefit of society. Was continuity as significant as change in the production of painters active in Venice in the Veneto, or who trained in the city? And can we apply the evocative phrase I used in my title, the longue durée, coined by the very influential French Annales historian Fernand Braudel in his study of the Mediterranean in the age of Philip II, to Venetian painting, viewed through the backward-looking lens of Giovanni Battista Tiepolo's paintings and drawings? And is there, more than coincidence, in the rather striking visual parallel which can be drawn between the three works of art on this slide: Giovanni Bellini's altarpiece for San Giovanni Crisostomo of 1513, Veronese's The Consecration of St. Nicholas, about which John and others have talked, admittedly not made for a church anywhere near Venice, but made in Venice, and Tiepolo's presentation model, a tiny, tiny thing on the far screen of 1737-38 for an altarpiece in San Sebastiano, Venice. The pictures destroyed, the oil sketches in the National Gallery. I must confess at this point a certain London bias regarding the images I'm discussing, because my thinking about Tiepolo, with which I'm really a dilettante more than anything else, has developed from being responsible for a very strong collection of his works at the Courtauld, and also from curating this exhibition about the intersection between his oil sketches and his drawings several years ago. Now, Tiepolo's work will be known to all of you, so I don't need to rehearse many details of his biography, but some might be helpful for those who are less familiar with the 18th century. Born in the late 1690s, his career maps out in some ways a very familiar path for 18th century Venetian painters. Think of Canaletto, Ricci, Zuccarelli, who also travelled abroad and worked extensively for foreign patrons. Unlike Titian, or even Veronese, few of the most talented Venetian artists of the 18th century were able to work primarily in Venice and the Veneto. Tiepolo didn't visit England like many of his contemporaries did, but he also travelled north, and most extraordinarily to Würzburg in Germany, where his greatest masterpieces, the frescoes of the Kaisersaal and the Grand Staircase, remain in situ in the Prince Bishop's Palace. And I show you here a view of the Grand Staircase, and also one of the quite considerable number of drawings made in relation to this commission. This one's in the Courtauld. And as an elderly man, Tiepolo made the even more arduous journey to Spain to paint in the Palacio Real in Madrid for the Bourbon King Charles III. And it was in Spain that he died in 1770, far from Venice, and even, it has been suggested very provocatively by Michael Levy, largely forgotten by Venetian painters and patrons. Tiepolo trained with Gregorio Lazzarini, and his earliest work shares the dark, moody palette and brownish-red colour of many 17th and early 18th century Venetian painters. He was open, I think, to almost everything and did not ignore the art of his own time, nor the intellectual or religious concerns of his contemporaries. Yet, increasingly often, his drawings and paintings seem to channel the work of his far earlier contemporaries. I go back to this slide, of his earlier compatriots, I should say, and especially those of the 16th century. It's also due to that, I think, that we pay less attention than we should today to the painters of 17th century Venice. Nostalgia may have played a part in this judgment, and this is certainly what 19th century writers thought. Think of Ruskin, Byron, Wordsworth, let alone Proust. And the end of the Venetian Republic in 1797 was not as far removed from their time as it is from ours, and even we still find it difficult to escape Wordsworth's extraordinary characterization of Settecento Venice in 1802 as the shade of that which was once great. But that is not how all 18th century Venetians and visitors to Venice saw it, at least not absolutely everybody. They were not possessed of our dangerous ability, with the benefit of hindsight, to see into what became their future. 18th century Venice was not the city it had been, but at the very least it remained until the very end one of the cultural, intellectual and hedonistic capitals of Europe. 18th century Venice retained a very lively artistic life, even if many of its painters were working for foreigners or had even gone abroad themselves. In several fundamental ways, the artistic world was not ordered radically differently than it had been for centuries, and this, I would argue, tended towards a certain conservatism and reverence for the past and for past artists. Yes, by the 18th century, there was an academy in Venice, and the painters of figures had managed finally, after several centuries, to form themselves into a guild, separated from the hoi polloi, as they saw it, of scene painters and other riffraff. But most artists, if they could manage it, preferred to order their activity, as they had done for centuries, in family workshops. There were huge advantages, of course, working towards a common goal and co-opting, if necessary, talented brothers and sons-in-laws to carry on the family name. And the great artistic dynasties of the 18th century do not seem much less numerous than those of early periods. We have, of course, the Canaletto Bellotto firm, the Guardi, the Longhi, and then, of course, the Tiepolos. Both Tiepolo's sons, Gian Domenico and Lorenzo, worked with their father from a very early age, travelling with him to Würzburg and then to Madrid. And during their father's lifetime, most of their activity was subsumed in their collective enterprise under the Tiepolo brand. But they both had very distinctive manners of their own, particularly Gian Domenico, who was a very mannered, wonderfully, slightly jerky sort of style. The family workshop as an artistic model had many advantages, but it did not encourage the development of more than one individual genius in each shop. So the prime forms of artistic patronage open to Venetian painters had also not altered radically in centuries. And this isn't surprising, as neither the structures by which the state had governed and the role which other communal bodies played in the city's life had changed. And until the fall of the Republic, the Doge remained Venice's ruler, an elective head of state, even if only a minuscule section of the population were involved in this selection. And artists competed to work from the state. Some vied to produce portraits of the Doge, although I don't think any reached the heights of 15th and 16th century examples, such as the great painting in London, which I can't resist showing you simply because it's so wonderful, by Giovanni Bellini of Doge Loredan, which is an uncanny, I think uncanny really is the word, an uncanny combination of the real person and the ideal of the office which he personified. And others worked on the decoration of the Doge's palace and state buildings elsewhere in the city. And here below, I'm showing you Tiepolo's canvas of the mid-1750s of Neptune, the god of the sea, offering gifts to Venice and leaning on the Lion of St. Mark. And this was made for a lunette below the vault in the Room of the Four Doors, the first room visitors came to after ascending the grand staircase, to replace a very damaged painting by Tintoretto of Neptune's marriage to Venus. In terms of the format and the subject represented, relatively little had changed from the days of Vittorio Carpaccio. I'm thinking of the Lion of St. Mark, of which I sadly don't have a slide here, although the style evidently had. The majority of the earlier paintings for the Doge's palace, particularly for the council chamber, were destroyed by fire, as we've heard, in the 16th century. But they must have had much in common, and in fact we know they had much in common with the narrative pictures made for the city's scuole, or lay confraternities, some of which of course do survive, and we've already heard about these a bit today. And they give the clearest sense of what monumental painting in 15th century Venice looked like. And this narrative tradition made a great impression on Tintoretto and Veronese, and thence also, I would argue, on Tiepolo. And the narrative pictures which the Venetian scuole commissioned for their premises tended to represent episodes from the lives of the saints or of miracles performed by relics owned by these confraternities, and members of the confraternities often participated in these painted scenes. The paintings were often rectangular in format, and architecture tended to play a very large role in their construction. And in the middle years of the 16th century, the production of pictures for the scuole continued. Think of Tintoretto's extraordinary dedication to San Rocco, which I show here, but they could also take different forms. And by the mid-18th century, by the 1730s, Tiepolo was engaged on paintings for them, such as the ceiling of Simeon's stock, still in situ in the Scuola Grande de Carmine, but also a group of small-scale works, of which I show you one here. This is a little painting of St. Roch, now in the Prince's Gate collection in the Courtauld. There are about 15 of these which survive, and they're very beautiful, very exquisite, and they seem to have been made for confraternity members. But I'd like to argue that two features from the 15th and early 16th century Venetian narrative painting tradition made an especial impression on subsequent painters in Venice. And the first of these was their use of impressive and complex architectural settings, whether these were interior or exterior. And on the screen closest to me, you see Mansueti's The Miraculous Healing of the Daughter of Benvenuto of San Paolo, dated 1505, for the Scuola of San Giovanni Evangelista, standing here as an exemplar, really, of this Quattrocento tradition. Mansueti is a very curious artist. He's maybe not a terribly successful one. He likes to jam his figures into every possible eventuality. But I think you do see in this example just the sort of crowded space which you could get in these scenes, even though it doesn't have the rectangular format that we tend to associate with them. But the long, thin rectangular format that we normally see in many of the scuole production migrated, together with the architecture, into other forms of large-scale painting in the 16th century, including the fashions for representations of Christ dining, whether at Emmaus, the marriage of Cana, or even the Last Supper. And I think it's hard to conceive completely of Veronese's grand tableau, such as the wedding feast at Cana, and his other great pictures without these antecedents. And moving further on in time, Tiepolo's scenography in the Banquet of Cleopatra for the Palazzo Labia, which I show at the bottom right of the 1740s, is, I would argue, an even later descendant of the crowd scenes within architectural settings established by Venetian painters of the 15th century. I'll come back to the Palazzo Labia commission later. Artists, of course, aren't just responsive to formats and types of pictures, but then, as is now, they look widely and they redeploy visual ideas, although, of course, sometimes, in fact, often actually, in different forms. And I wanted to look at some of the visual connections that I can see between Tiepolo's pictures and earlier works of art, which suggest that he knew them, or at least compositions very like them, by the same artist. Now, I'm going to skip this because I'm worried I'm running out of time, and look at this example, which may seem a slightly strange one. I want to compare one of a group of highly finished pen and ink drawings of the Virgin and Child, or the Holy Family, which Tiepolo made in Venice in the late 1750s, here with a Madonna by Giovanni Bellini of the early 16th century, the Madonna of the Meadow, so-called, in the National Gallery in London. Now, William Barkham has written of the variety of Tiepolo's references to 16th century precedents in his altarpieces, in Tiepolo's altarpieces and small-scale devotional works of the 1730s. But I think we can also see these connections in Tiepolo's later work, such as the series of around 70 works to which this sheet belongs. The drawings, such as this one, which was recently on show at the Frick, are very calm and stately and have a repose which we don't often expect from Tiepolo's enormously energetic compositional studies. This drawing belonged to an album which Tiepolo gave to the Somasco convent in Venice in 1762 before he left for Madrid, and the album was dispersed in England after 1885. We don't know if Tiepolo made these drawings for himself or for a member of the convent, but we can suppose that the album was intended to give both spiritual and artistic solace and material for devotional meditation. And in this sheet, which I think is one of the most beautiful of the group, Tiepolo makes the three figures into one one shape. Certainly the figures of Joseph and of Mary almost fall into each other and create an organic whole. And this melding of forms, the repose and solemnity of the Virgin, Child, and St. Joseph, remind me of Giovanni Bellini's very silent, mournful late Virgins, and particularly the Madonna of the Meadow, where the Christ child sits on Mary's lap, prone, and reminds the viewer of his fate on the cross. The drapery in the picture, such as also in Tiepolo's drawing, falls in very complex and interesting ways, like the cloak which seems to envelop Joseph and Mary in Tiepolo's drawings. Now, I don't want to suggest that Tiepolo had exactly this painting in mind. We know nothing of its history before it entered the Costabile collection, from which it was sold to the National Gallery in 1858. But I think it is representative of the contemplative mood of Bellini's private devotional pictures, and Tiepolo definitely did know some of Bellini's paintings, as I will demonstrate. I think it's also very typical of Tiepolo's inventiveness that he might transliterate such a model into a completely different form, yet retaining its stillness and restraint. Paul Hills has written very movingly of Venice's very particularly reflected light, refracted even, seen in the waters surrounding the city and in the mosaics which remained a living art form in Venice long after their productions ceased elsewhere in Western Europe. And Hills has connected the depictions of light and mosaics in Giovanni Bellini's San Giobbe altarpiece, which you see on the far screen, and the representation of light and colour in 16th century altarpieces like Titian's Assumption of the Virgin in the Frari, to their painters' experiences of light, water, and mosaics. And I think that Tiepolo also shared this sensibility, and it seems to have been mediated through Bellini and Titian. And the oil sketch you see here on the left was given by Tiepolo to the family of his erstwhile collaborator, Antonio Fantoni, in the 1730s. And it portrays the Virgin and Child holding the rosary in an apse with an angel, surrounded, as it would seem, by the golden sort of tesserae of a mosaic. And the apse, which doesn't have a figurative aspect, unlike Bellini's painting, possibly even has more to do with Titian's Assumption than it does with the Bellini here. And I'd like you to remember from this slide to the next, the heaviness and the monumentality of the Virgin's body in Tiepolo's oil sketch, and the angels, particularly that on the far left, the one who seems to be holding up the Virgin's robe, when you look at Titian's Assumption of the Virgin, which now, as in the 18th century, stands on the high altar of the Church of the Frari in Venice. I also think, rather, that Tiepolo retained a consciousness of Titian's painting, even at the end of his life in Madrid. And on the far side is Tiepolo's oil sketch of the Immaculate Conception for an altarpiece in the church of San Pasquale Bailon in Aranjuez. The finished picture is now in the Prado, but it only remained in the church for 6 months before it was replaced after Tiepolo's death. And in the oil sketch, which was probably made for King Charles III's confessor to approve, or not, and which is now in the courthold, one fully understands Tiepolo's conception, and one that, in its presentation of the Virgin, who steps forward as if she's dancing, like Titian's Virgin Assunta, recalls the picture that Tiepolo had grown up with many years ago in Venice. Tiepolo admired Titian, though he didn't state it explicitly as he did for Veronese, and there are many connections, I think, of scale, grandeur, and conception between their works. And in particular, the strong, massive, and simplified figures found in Tiepolo's work before 1740, which Frederick mentioned, I think have a real affinity with Titian. I mentioned the oil sketch of the Virgin and the Rosary. Tiepolo's large-scale work of this subject, to which the oil sketch doesn't seem to relate, which was made for a church in Vicenza, is strongly monumental and Titian-esque. And on the left here, you have Titian's late Annunciation, commissioned by a merchant, Cornovi della Vecchia, for the Venetian church in San Salvatore, which Stevens talked about. The picture was probably painted in the mid-1560s, and it remains in situ. And beside it is Tiepolo's early Annunciation of 1725, now in the Hermitage. And Tiepolo's representation of the light conveyed to the Holy Spirit bears comparison with Titian's depiction of the same subject. They're not identical. Tiepolo avoids the sea of putti surrounding Titian's Holy Spirit, but why should they be? Looking for direct copies of works when tracing reception is a thankless task, as artists, I'm glad to say, are much more inventive. All the same, Tiepolo, I think, has looked carefully and closely at Titian's visualization of light and responded also to the colors of the latter's painting. But most fundamental to any examination of Tiepolo's receptiveness to the art of the past is, of course, Veronese. The connections were first made in Tiepolo's lifetime, and as Michael Levy wrote in a lecture given in London in the late 1950s, Tiepolo's dependence on and relation to Veronese is almost the only aspect of his genius which struck his contemporaries at Venice. It was the perceptive critic, the younger Anton Maria Zanetti, who saw Tiepolo as spanning a great gap of time and, more than any other painter, reawakening the charming and delightful conceptions of Veronese until then dormant. And it's not surprising that Tiepolo looked long and hard at Veronese. Practical reasons combine with more theoretical and stylistic ones. For an artist who wished to paint on walls as well as ceilings, as Tiepolo did throughout his Venetian years, from the Palazzo Sandi ceiling of the mid-1720s to the decoration of Santa Maria del Rosario in the Palazzo Labi in the 1740s, as of course further afield, such as this sketch, which is for the Villa Valorama, there was no other worthy precedent. There were huge problems with fresco painting in the dampness of Venice. So why did Tiepolo and his patrons embark on this perilous enterprise? In fact, it's rather miraculous that these pictures survive today, though their condition is not altogether straightforward. One incentive was the huge appeal of Veronese to 18th century collectors and patrons in Venice and elsewhere in Europe. No Venetian painter was more admired than Veronese, even if now we do not consider him wholly Venetian. Grand tourists and other visitors to the city were strongly encouraged to go to the Pisani Palace and to see the great painting of the family of Darius before Alexander, of which we've heard so much over the last 2 days. And it helped Tiepolo's reputation and the sale of his works to be considered in the light of Veronese. Beneath is an oil sketch of the Banquet of Cleopatra, which is also in the National Gallery, and I always like to think that although it would be crazy to put these two pictures together because they're almost more disparate in scale than anything else in the collection, it would be very interesting for examining the relationship of these two artists. So being seen as Veronese's heir helped Tiepolo's reputation and the sale of his work. And it's only with an understanding of this that we can comprehend why he helped Algarotti pass off as a Veronese, a picture which he must have known was by the Veronese workshop, though maybe we're not sure what we know about that now, representing the rape of Europa to the Elector of Saxony. The Veronese is now in Dresden. Tiepolo's autographed copy of it was bequeathed to the National Gallery of Scotland by Sir Stephen Runciman about 10 years ago. The connection, of course, was not just a cynical sales device. It happened to be true. Tiepolo didn't travel widely till his artistic characteristics were fully formed. And there was no one else other than Veronese from whom he could have learnt his characteristic manner of placing figures in spaces filled with light and colour on a monumental scale. And Tiepolo responded primarily to Veronese's historical and mythological paintings. He particularly admired, I think, looking at his pictures, Veronese's ability to give his pictures a believable sense of time and place. When Tiepolo produced his history paintings, he made them look as if they happened in the time of Veronese. He was inspired by his reverence for the painter, but also the nostalgia which his contemporaries shared for the glory of 16th century Venice. Their past is seen through Veronese's vision of his adopted city. And I'd like to finish by looking at one spectacular example of the creative way in which Tiepolo used Veronese's example to reimagine the past. In the 1740s, although it's still debated exactly when, Tiepolo received his grandest commission in Venice, the decoration of the ballroom of the Palazzo Labia, with scenes from the love affair of the Roman general Antony and the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra. And here on the screen, I'm showing you the banquet of Antony and Cleopatra. Now, the Labia were a family who were notorious for their conspicuous consumption, a strong contrast to the Venetian principle of mediocritas, and the subject is very fitting for them. And one has some sense of their combination of ostentation and also prudence. A generation or so before, a member of the family is said to have had a banquet served on golden plates. They were chucked into the canal, but nets were very prudently placed to catch them. And I think we get some sense of this in the lavish extravaganza of Tiepolo's imagination, but conveyed without any real gold, all just in paint. And the ballroom frescoes were a collaboration between Tiepolo, actually I'll go back to this one, and the decorative painter Mangozzi Colonna, who produced the architectural surround. And Tiepolo's primary concern was to visualize an event which had apparently happened, but which belonged really to the realm of mythology and fantasy. And the classical past, as Tiepolo imagines it, is ahistorical. And just to make a rather ludicrous comparison, I wanted to compare it to the slide that Susanna showed you earlier, the image Giovanni Bellini's sculpted relief painting for the Corner family of the early 16th century, a totally different solution to how to reimagine antiquity which had some sort of Venetian setting. And Tiepolo places it within a fantastic world with links to the Venetian rather than to the Roman past, where Antony's Romanized armor and the 16th century inspired costume of Cleopatra meet on very equal territory. And of course there is, as I said, this sense of the great nostalgia of looking back to the 16th century when Venice still ruled the Mediterranean and not just the small city. And he uses, Tiepolo here, the same epic pictorial forms, scales and tropes which Veronese had used for his depiction of the family of Darius before Alexander. And of course in Veronese's painting we've heard how it shows the encounter between Alexander and the family of his vanquished foe. And Veronese glories in all the exotic details of the court, with the monkey, and the horses, the dwarves, other things we've noticed. And Tiepolo does something which is very, very similar, really. The riches of Egypt and Cleopatra are conveyed by her ostentatious and theatrical Veronesian dress. And as she drops the pearl into the wine, showing, of course, her incredible sort of not being bothered by worldly concerns, a dwarf climbs up the step and towards the dining room table. And in the oil sketch, though not in the final fresco, a monkey sits and watches, just as happens in the painting that was in the Pisani Palace in the 18th century, the Veronese. Antony's worthy companion is conveyed into some sort of luxurious Oriental who's seated at the front of the table, his back to us. And Antony's moral lassitude is conveyed by his theatrical Roman dress, while Veronese's Alexander seems full of rectitude, young and bareheaded. Antony is presented almost as a figure of fun here and in other paintings from the series, and certainly not with respect. His body is slightly plump and less than ideal as he gazes adoringly at Cleopatra. The historical scenes gain their sense of theatricality and unbelievability from Tiepolo and his collaborators' plundering of the architectural surrounds and effects found in other grand compositions by Veronese, such as the Marriage at Cana, and particularly Veronese's work with Palladio, such as at the Villa at Mazara. The real architecture of the space, such as here, and the fictive scenography of the painted walls merge into one. The impression is astonishing, that of no distinction almost being made between the revelers in the ballroom and the space inhabited by Antony and Cleopatra. We don't look into the past, but we, the viewer, are part of it, as well as of the present. So, in my talk today, I have looked, rather more quickly than I hoped, I think, at the structures and rationale for why an artist such as Tiepolo would wish to engage with the art of his predecessors. I've argued that the structures of artistic life in Venice in the 18th century, as well as the 15th century, encourage such approach. However, the dangers of such a Brodelian longue durée approach is that it weakens our understanding of individual agency within this collective picture. But I have also suggested that artists were not locked in an impossible structure, and the terms in which they looked at and made use of the art of the past were absolutely their own. Tiepolo's success, I would argue, was helped by the comparisons his contemporaries made between him and Veronese, and he did not discourage them. But there is a further way in which Tiepolo's reputation, his future life as it were, has parallels with that of Veronese too. Both have been tarred with the brush of being decorative or pretty painters who thought of little but to entertain and to give pleasure. As we have heard today, this does not hold true for Veronese. Neither does it for Tiepolo, a spectacular painter of great power and emotion who happened on occasions also to be a painter of joy and happiness. History has a tendency to repeat itself, and one of Venice's great Renaissance painters, ironically, died less than 20 years before the French Revolution. Thank you.
So we're going to give everyone a 5-minute break to allow our host to reset the stage and come back and join us for what I hope will be some fun.